Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. Let me start out by apologizing for my extended absence. After my illness, I tried to get started again on the lesser-known X-Men series so I could wrap up this iteration of the show, as announced months ago, but my heart just wasn't in it anymore. I hope to occasionally return to the original format. Among other things, I do want to cover Volume 5 of the New Warriors, with Speedball's last major appearances as of this date, but I'm ready to move on to a new version of the show. I've done a couple of interviews so far, first with writer of comics and video games Evan Skolnick, and then with writer and musician J.M. DeMatteis. I actually worked as an interviewer professionally for some time, and I'm looking forward to doing that again in this new version of the show. I'm currently lining up talent to discuss their careers with, mostly comic book writers and artists, but hopefully with others who belong in Geektown in other ways. While I get those first few episodes ready to go, I'm going to give a rerun of the first two interviews. We'll start with part one of my discussion with Evan Skolnick. Thank you to him for reaching out to me and suggesting the interview. I'm not sure I'd be starting this new version of the show if it weren't for that. And before we play that interview, I must give a very special shout out to my patrons. You've stuck with me during this absence, with one exception, but I know she lost her job, so that's understandable. I've paused billing for at least a month, possibly longer depending on when I get actual new content out. Thank you once again to all of you. All of you being Mike Sterling, Justin Bailey, Lily and Sam Breen, Jesse Clark, Ricky Garvin, Rob Garrison, Aaron Woodward, Aaron Borst, Carla Hoffman, Julio Herrera, and Matthew Saint. If this new version of the show doesn't appeal, I completely understand, but I hope you'll stick with me and enjoy it enough to keep going, and that eventually others join you as well. You can do so at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown if you so desire, and it will stay just $1 per month once billing is unpaused. But now let's take a trip back to April 2020 to hear the first part of my discussion with Evan Skolnick. My guest today is comic book writer, game writer, and professor Evan Skolnick. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here, Kurt.
So, let's start back at the very beginning. As I understand, you got started when you were still a teenager writing a self-published D&D magazine called Fantasy. Is that right?
Yeah, or as my friends at the time used to rib me, Pahantasy, because it was a PH, fantasy with a PH. But yeah, it was a Dungeons and Dragons. I guess you'd call it a fanzine now. I called it a magazine. I was a bit lofty, but I called it. At first it was actually called Pegasus, and I started this while I was in actually middle school. My friends and I were starting to get into D&D, and there was this magazine called Dragon Magazine that TSR was putting out at the time, and I thought, well, I could do something like that, and so. I called it Pegasus and got some friends to write some articles and stuff. And then after that first issue came out, an actual publisher, an actual real publisher put out a role-playing magazine called Pegasus. And so I realized I wasn't going to start a legal battle with a large corporation. So I pivoted into calling it Fantasy Magazine, and it ran like 6 issues. The last one was a double issue, so I guess technically it's 7 issues. And I did this while I was in high school mainly, and it came out intermittently. I was able to corral friends and people I had met who wanted to contribute articles and artwork to it. I actually recruited some artists who had their work appearing, whose work had appeared in Dragon magazine, etc., to do work in my little magazine. And it was loads of fun and a great experience. And I learned a lot about editing and managing a creative team and the reality of publishing. And I was so young that like in order to print the thing, my dad had to drive me down to the print shop because I couldn't drive yet.
Yeah.
So I was a weird kid.
Well, most of us who played D&D, I think, were. Do you still play at all?
I wish I could say yes, but it's been so long. I just haven't, I haven't had the time. And that's part of the reason. And part of the reason is simply time is the issue. I mean, time and creativity. If you're going to be a dungeon master, it's basically like writing a comic book series. It's a lot of creative work you need to do unless you're going to use the prepackaged modules. Once I moved to New York from Connecticut, away from my family and friends, I really never managed to find a local group there that I was aware of, and so I didn't really play from that point on. And yeah, it's had a resurgence in recent years. I love hearing my students in my classes now talking about their D&D campaigns and actually talking about the lessons that they're learning from my classes being directly applicable to being a dungeon master, to creating interactive stories. So that's
nice.
That's kind of funny how things come around like that.
Yeah. And I read that you did put in one of your D&D characters into a comic book at one point.
Yeah, into a Marvel comic. I managed to shoehorn my favorite D&D character as a teen into the Marvel universe, and I think this has gotten written up a few places lately, but the character was named Chaos, Khaos, and he's a dark elf, a drow, with wings and all kinds of cool stuff that had happened in the course of my campaign with my friends. And this is, of course, when I was a player, not a dungeon master. And yeah, I pitched it as a Marvel series, and it didn't really go anywhere. But then when the 1993 annuals were coming out, and there was a demand that every annual feature a brand new Marvel character, I saw my chance, and I pitched to write the Excalibur annual, the lead story, and got accepted. And not only is Chaos in there, but all my friends' characters are in there in a like a flashback sequence, and like our entire campaign is like squeezed into, I think, like a 6 or 8 page sequence. It was just my biggest Mary Sue moment ever when I kind of shoehorned basically my alter ego into the Marvel universe. And it was kind of picked up on, in recent years that, hey, this looks like a D&D character. I was like, yeah, it was mine. So,
well, at least you're honest about it, not trying to hide his origins. It's
really very difficult to hide. In fact, I was at the same time editing Marvel Year in Review. Mm-hmm. And the years that I edited it for 2 years, and I really kind of changed the tone of it from being kind of like the Time magazine of the Marvel Universe to being the Spy magazine of the Marvel Universe, meaning very satirical and, very acidic and kind of biting the hand that feeds me. And part of the reason I probably, was no longer doing it after 2 years. But we had this, we parodied pretty much everything that was happening that year. And we parodied the new Marvel characters that were in all those annuals. And I actually wrote the copy for Chaos. And I basically said, that sinking feeling when some D&D nerd tries to tell you about the latest campaign? That's what this character feels like. So I really, I wasn't hiding it at all. I was actually poking fun at it myself because, I didn't do it as a joke. I really did think this character had potential. But yeah, when you look back on it, it is a bit, a little bit embarrassing.
Since we're talking about Marvel, how exactly did you get your first job there? You started out as an editorial assistant, as I understand it?
Yeah. Basically the very bottom rung of the editorial department, kind of an assistant to the editor-in-chief and the executive editor, but also kind of on hand to help anybody that needed help with kind of mostly menial type tasks, but not all of them. I graduated college from the University of Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut, and I realized that I was probably going to end up going to publishing. I had been trained as a journalist, but also studied English literature and graphic design. And while I was in college, I actually wrote and drew a 5 days a week comic strip in the school paper. The UConn had a very robust journalism department and a daily newspaper that circulated to, like 10,000 students every day. And so it was a lot of work, but and I had some of my friends did help with some of the ideas and with the writing, but mostly it was my responsibility, and it kind of burned me out after a couple of semesters. But anyway, I graduated. I was working as a local newspaper reporter in Connecticut, but I really wanted to go to New York. I was interviewing mostly at magazines, but like comic books, Marvel was like, the pipe dream. And so I wanted to, it was like a dream. I didn't think I would get it, but it was a dream job. So I kept kind of calling them and saying, hey, I'm going to be in New York on some other interviews. Do you have any openings? And they would say no. And I'd say, well, can I just come in for like an informational interview? That was a thing back then, informational interview, where someone would bring you in and just kind of show you around and introduce you. And so Kelly Corvise, who was the editorial assistant at that time, I believe, was nice enough to say, yeah, you can come up. I'll show you around, meet a few people. And so I did that, which was great, and shook a few hands, etc. And then I was, back to Connecticut, working my dead-end newspaper job, wishing I was doing something more interesting. And I would call them again. I get more interviews in New York at other magazines, and I would say, hey, can I come back and look, anything open? Like, nope. I said, well, can I come by anyway? And they're like, yeah, okay. And so this happened like 3 times, where I was continually just kind of, they let me in the door. So I was making myself known, I guess, and left my resume with HR. And I remember the 3rd time, I think it was, the woman in HR called me in to sit down with her. And she said, have you applied to DC and DC Comics? And I said, no, I'm really not interested in that. I'm really a Marvel guy. And I remember she was like, okay. And an opening came up a few months later, and they thought of me, partly based on my being a pest, and partly, I think, based on my background. And I managed to get an interview, and I managed to get the job. So that's where I started. That's how I got started there. So I moved to New York City, and I was off on my adventure.
Nice. Now, it didn't take long for you to be promoted up to assistant editor. It's funny that editorial assistant and assistant editor sound kind of similar, but I'm pretty sure they're very different roles. Can you kind of elaborate on the difference there?
Sure. Yeah, there was only one, at that time, there was only one editorial assistant. Like I said, it was mainly to provide support for the editor-in-chief, the executive editors, and any other tasks that their administrative assistants might want to pass off. So whereas being an assistant editor meant working in an editorial office. An editorial office consisted of an editor and an assistant editor, a 2-person team with a certain number of books in their stable that they were assigned to put out every month, to hire freelancers, to fire freelancers, to edit the work, to help shape it, etc. So working as an assistant editor meant working on actual monthly series and special projects, as opposed to, more providing more general support for the department.
Mm-hmm. So with working in editing, were you always hoping to kind of turn this into a writing gig, or did that just kind of happen to come along? Because I know back then there was definitely a lot of crossover between editorial and writing.
Yeah, it was always in my mind from the very first day I got there that one of the paths to becoming a writer at Marvel was to be at Marvel and be known, and to get your break there, and then to get so much work that you could eventually potentially leave and go freelance. And that was definitely a path that I had in mind. It wasn't like I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could, because I didn't. I was really enjoying it. And I feel like, looking back on it, I think I'm at least as strong an editor as a writer, maybe a stronger editor than a writer even. I think I maybe work better when I have something to work with as opposed to a complete blank page. But yeah, that was definitely in my mind coming in the door, that I wanted to start writing for Marvel Comics, definitely.
In addition to your other work, I noticed your credits list you as a colorist a number of times.
Yeah, this was something that most people could learn. This was back in the days before fancy digital Photoshop coloring. This was back in the day when we would take mostly watercolors called Dr. Martens, and we would take Xeroxes of the full-size art boards and shrink them down to regular 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper on a copying machine. and you would color that copy with watercolors, and then you had to then go in and mark every single color that you used with a proper code, with a separation code, which told the separators what percentage of the 4 printing colors that color actually is, because there's only 4 actual printing colors, right? If you look closely at a comic book or any printed material, you see those little dots, and that's just, you're seeing tiny mixtures of the 4 printed colors, CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and K stands for black for some reason. So yeah, people did that for a little extra money, because believe me, we were not paid very well at that time, and living in New York City. But also, my background was in writing and art, and finding someplace like Marvel where both of those things were important to know was fantastic. And so I was able to, bring my knowledge of color theory and art and graphic design into my coloring work. So it wasn't just something that I did. It was something that I was able to, I feel like, do at a fairly competent level, given that we couldn't really do a lot of gradations or shadows or things like that. You couldn't do a lot of fancy stuff back then, because the people who were interpreting, because what would happen is you would basically paint this watercolor, and then we'd ship it off with the actual pages to the separators, and someone would sit on a big computer and interpret it. And they were not using Photoshop. They were using I don't know what they were using, but in the old days, they were using actual sheets of plastic like Rubylith, and they would cut with an X-Acto knife around the shape. So you can imagine they weren't too thrilled with the idea of doing very precise gradations or shadows and everything. So you had to do very basic coloring back then. But eventually, as we know, first with Image, the switch over to home computers running Photoshop made for a huge leap forward in quality. But at the time I first started coloring, that stuff wasn't really possible.
Right. Now, talking beforehand, you mentioned that you kind of helped drag Marvel into that new era. Can you tell me a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, sometimes I was so concerned with the quality of my product that I kind of rubbed the system the wrong way. And this is probably one of those times where I was more concerned about the product than my own standing at the company. And so this was what was happening was Image books were coming out, and around this time, this was the first 2 years of the 90s, maybe 93, 94, something like that. They were using nice hot glossy paper, and they were using Photoshop coloring, and it looked amazing. And we were like, all the editors at Marvel were like, why can't we do that? And we were basically being told, oh, that's, those books are always late because of that process, and we can't do that and meet our schedules. And there was all kinds of excuses why we couldn't do that. And it was very frustrating for I think a lot of us, certainly for me. I can only speak for myself, but I got the impression that it was frustrating watching the Image books coming out and having a color that was just so far beyond what we were seeing in Marvel books. And Marvel, we think of Marvel as the number one comic book company. There should be nobody out there producing stuff that's as successful or as great to read and look at as ours. So we felt a bit handcuffed. So during the middle of all this, someone approached me. His name was Eric Hector, and he had a company called Heroic Age, and they did Photoshop color separations. And he had a proposal. He said, I think I can do this for you that would match your budget and would look something like what you're seeing in Image books. And so I realized that if I ran it up the chain through normal channels, I would get the same answer. Can't do that. It's too expensive, blah, blah, blah. So I just kind of went straight to our manufacturing department, the people who are actually responsible for interacting with our printers and our separators. And I said, look, can I use this separator if I want? Here are the files he's going to hand off. Here's how he's going to do it. And they looked at it and they said, yeah, we can do that. So I think it was Doctor Strange number 60, on which I was the editor. They did the color and separations. And it looked, pretty damn good. It had that Photoshop look to it, It was printed on regular newsprint, so it wasn't as vibrant as a shiny Image book at that time, but it looked head and shoulders above everything else that was coming out from Marvel at that time in terms of coloring. And I remember when the make-readies came out. Make-readies are the when the printer starts printing the comic books, before they bind them and do all the fancy stuff to get them ready to print, they ship off just like sheets of the actual sheets to Marvel right away. so we can take a quick look and make sure there's no major problems. And so we would get these things called make-readies, which are basically the comic book that you had sent out to the printers maybe 3 or 4 weeks earlier. And basically, by the time you got a make-ready, it was almost impossible to stop them from reaching the store. So I used to joke that, the reason they're called make-readies is because it's make-ready your excuse is because it's shipping, in case there was a problem. But anyway, every editorial office got a copy of the make-readies. And as soon as Doctor Strange 60 make-ready started coming around, I had like 2 or 3 editors come down. How did you do this? Came down to my office and said, how did you do this? How did you get this to look like this? So that kind of was the first time that a regular Marvel comic book had that kind of coloring. And I kind of had proven that it was within our ability to do that. And that kind of opened the door, which eventually, led to that process eventually seeping into the woodwork at Marvel.
Right. Eventually, Marvel ended up buying Malibu, which a lot of the motivation for that was their computer coloring system.
Yeah. So it was one of those cases where I did this thing that I think helped the company, but I don't know that it helped my standing politically there, because I'd kind of done a bit of an end run. Yeah. But sometimes that's what you need to do to move things forward, especially if there's leadership in place that's kind of what you'd call more old school and resistant to maybe new stuff.
That concludes part 1 of my interview with Evan Skolnick. Stay tuned for part 2 next week, and if you have any questions for a regular episode of the show, go ahead and send me an email at welcometogeektown@gmail.com. Or you can go to www.welcome2, the number 2 in that case, geektown.com, and click Submit a Question if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them,
welcome to Geektown. Population, us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.